Yo, hello people. How is everyone doing? It's been a while, hasn't it? Just hit me up quickly in the chat. I know there's only about, well, there's a few of us. 14, growing up quite fast. Fantastic. I think you can all hear me, but just hit a 1 in the chat just to know, let me know that audio is good or well and good. Yeah, so, well, you haven't missed anything, Renaissance Woman. The issue, well, I say issue, I kind of got to a point last week where I missed one live stream, and then the next day came and I was like, I still really don't have anything prepared. And then that happened over and over and over again. And I ended up essentially just taking a bit of a week off. I think I was somewhat fatigued, a little bit exhausted. And my brain just shut down and said, yeah, you need some time off the live streams, dude. So respect to all the Twitchers and Kick streamers out there who do this for a living. It ain't easy, man. Yeah, thank you for joining me, guys. Roughly 20 in the room, which is nice numbers for a weekday evening. Yeah, I think I was totally exhausted, Joy. So yeah, there you go. But I'm here now, feel somewhat rejuvenated, and we've got a good topic, a relatively interesting topic, I'd like to say. At least I'd imagine that you guys will find it interesting. And yes, we're back on the Black Europeans topic. Wildflower says you were right about the Black Europeans. Well, here's the funny thing. I think a lot of you, well, I'm not going to say a lot of you, I'm not going to presume anything, but I'd forgive you if you thought that this latest article regarding the West African ancestry of some of these Britons that came through, the boy and the girl, I'd forgive some of you for me thinking that I would read that and would read vindication into it. To me, I found it entirely unsurprising, first of all. And secondly, it actually somewhat, I'm not going to say it worries me, but we have to be very careful about the way this information is going to be used. That was what I thought instantly when this came out. I didn't like the way it was being presented, and we're going to see that as we go through the study together. What they'll try and do is what they do with all ancient African DNA studies, basically, is they're going to try and use sub-Saharan as a proxy for Black, and then make the argument not sub-Saharan, therefore not Black. And one of the things we have to be mindful of is that when we initially had this discussion, you know, if you've seen the live stream I did on this a few months back now, I did a live stream about how Black was Britain, basically. And none of that argument was based on the finding of sub-Saharan DNA. In fact, quite the opposite. It was based on anthropology. It was based on essentially physical anthropology, you know, skull measurements and facial features. Yeah, and that's basically how they, and obviously then there was the genetic information, but the genetic information that came through was based on using things like the high-risk model to measure how dark their skin was, as we saw with Cheddar Man. So we had these different techniques being used, none of them based on ancestry, still determining that these people were Black. And yet now with this latest study, what you'll see is they're going to try and use sub-Saharan DNA, just like they do in the, you know, the study of Nurat Man, to say, oh, well, this is where sub-Saharan DNA sits. They're going to try and use that as a way of, yeah, basically pigeonholing and pushing to the side Black ancestry. And as long as we get ahead of that and we're aware of that, then there's no issues there. Hugh, I think you need to get your system sorted out. I think audio is fine, everyone else is saying. So I hope you can eventually hear us. Okay, so what I thought we'd do today is we're going to dive into that study. It's actually not that hard of a study to follow. It's pretty straightforward. So we'll go through it together so you guys are all up to speed about exactly what's been discovered and what the implications are. But I also wanted to, before we dive into the study, just have a bit of a review of what we covered in the last live stream very quickly in terms of where we are at the moment in terms of Black presence in historical Britain and the wider Western European area. Where are we at the moment? What do we know from the studies, or at least what has been released, at least from the studies in terms of the peopling of these areas? And then see, like I said, how much or little of that is dependent upon sub-Saharan ancestry. And just to be really, really clear about this whole sub-Saharan ancestry thing, you remember when I had Dr. Sasha Enriquez on the channel, and she spoke about the underrepresentation of Africans in DNA studies. In other words, we have very little in terms of African DNA to be able to make these kinds of conclusions. That situation hasn't improved drastically. And you have to bear in mind how much more genetically diverse Africans are in comparison to Eurasians. Okay, we are much, much more diverse than them. So they, you know, the kind of rule of thumb, it's not really a rule of thumb, but a kind of like going thing is that we probably need around 20 times the amount of African DNA that we have of European DNA to be able to get the same kind of fidelity that we're getting from studies of Europeans that we are in that we are currently from Africans. Okay, so at the moment, Europeans, we've got a high level of fidelity in terms of being able to kind of like see, you know, where people have moved around Europe. We haven't got any of that picture because we've probably got multiple factors less DNA from Africa, but we require multiple factors more. So we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of understanding what Africa looks like, particularly in, you know, ancient Africa. We have no idea what ancient Africa looks like, let alone modern Africa. So when they find two things and they're like, oh yeah, these, you know, these two Africans are unrelated, it's like, well, no SHIT, Sherlock, we know that. That's why we're trying to gather more ancient African DNA and modern African DNA to build up a bigger picture and to understand where these groups sit. So yeah, anyway, that I just want to throw that out there. And yeah, let's go through this. Let's start going through this presentation together. I'll try my best to keep an eye on the chat as I do this. And we're gonna kind of breeze through the presentation, what we already covered, to kind of bring us up to speed. And then we'll take a little bit more time when we're actually going through the articles themselves. This is a relatively weighty topic, but I still don't want to do a late live stream. So I think once it hits, if we hit the hour and a half mark, I'll probably pause it at that point and we'll part two it for tomorrow. But let's see how we get through, because there is the possibility that we'll just kind of like, it will just be smooth and we'll breeze through it. So let's see how it goes. Okay. All right. So Anglo-Blaxons, by the way, I kind of like that thumbnail. I think I've done well there. I'm quite proud of that, like I was with the Melon Ninjas one. I was like, yeah, Anglo-Blaxons, I like that. That's pretty cool. Anyway, let's move on. So this is right now we're just doing a review of what we've already covered. So these slides that I'm going to go through, I'm going to go through them really, really quickly, okay? Because I just want to bring people up to speed in terms of what we covered before. So new study finds, so this is not new anymore, this was a few months ago. New study finds that builders of the Stonehenge were Black. And we had lots of sensationalist headlines saying the Stonehenge builders were Black. Now, obviously, we know it's more nuanced than that. We know this is related to essentially the Hyrasplex findings and finding out that their skin was somewhere in the dark to black range. Okay, so we know that they were dark skinned. Now, Is there more in terms of physiognomy that relates them to Black people? I think so. I mean, I've looked at Cheddar Man's skull. I think that's a skull that belongs to someone of African ancestry, or who would in modern times say has African ancestry. But this is where the debate lies, okay? Because it's hard to get more than that from these studies. But anyway, then moving on, okay, Britons were mostly Black 5,000 years ago. We can see from different kind of media outlets who were covering it. The ancient Irish were Blacks with blue eyes, says the Irish Times, etc., etc. Okay, and obviously people get upset about these kind of headlines and findings. And then I just kind of like gave this a bit of a logical observation just based on what we're finding out at the moment. So in terms of modern populations, all modern populations with dark to black skin have either African or South Asian phenotype. Those are the only two groups who you would say have dark to black skin. They're either Africans or they're people from South Asia / the Indian Ocean. There's no other people kind of like around the world who have skin that you'd classify as dark to black skin. That's the darkest level on the high-risk plex model. All modern pygmy populations, aside from Taron and Myanmar, and who ancestrally were Black anyway, have a melanated Black phenotype. So when we come across pygmies or short-statured human beings, we can almost infer that they're Black, because the only modern pygmies that exist to this day tend to all be Black populations. Only Black Africans have been found to be without or have very little Neanderthal admixture. This is another conclusion. Okay, this is just a logical observation. If you find someone with zero Neanderthal or very trace amounts of Neanderthal ancestry, they are invariably Black. Just tends to be the case. Okay, that's not me making it up. That's just a fact of the matter. Okay, so if you find people, hey, no Neanderthal ancestry, it's a fair assumption to say this person is probably going to be a Black person, because we just don't have the modern reference of someone carrying zero Neanderthal DNA who isn't Black. Okay, so that's how we can kind of infer these things. All right, that's not a stretch, and that's not a logical fallacy, because essentially it hasn't been unproven yet. Eurocentrists flip-flop between African, North African, Sub-Saharan, Eurasian, racial, geographic, genetic, and phenotypic descriptors to keep people confused about Europe's obvious Black origins. So Europe was a Black continent. That's just a fact. It's a fact because of out of Africa. We know the first Europeans were Black. None of this should be controversial. Every continent on the planet was Black first before it became something else. So the only discussion or argument to be had is, when did it become non-Black? When did non-Blackness become dominant in these various geolocations across the world? That's the only discussion to be had. Anyone who wants to argue or make the argument about Blacks not being present on any continent is an idiot. I'm just telling you that now. Okay, Blacks were first on every continent. So that's the only discussion to be had. Dark skin is subjective and constantly moving to shoot Eurocentric agenda. And this is something that you'll see is going to be increasingly the case. It's a sign. They've created these scientific skin pigmentation boundaries. In fact, we might as well go into the next slide at that stage. These kind of like very clear scientific skin pigmentation boundaries, with the last two, dark and dark to black, essentially belonging to members of the Black race, maybe spilling into, you know, people who are, you know, obviously Asians and stuff like that will also kind of like South Asians will also be present somewhere in this dark to black range as well. But really, it's almost, if you're geographically talking about the African continent and someone has this complexion, then we'll just essentially call them a Black person. That tends to be how it works. However, now that so many people, by their own unit of measurement, because this is how the high-risk plex gives its estimations about complexion, it uses this model. And dark to black skin is this type 6, dark skin is type 5, this dark brown skin. Intermediate is these two central ones, light brown and moderate brown. And then pale skin is white skin here, and very pale skin is pale white skin here. So this is what the high-risk plex is using. This is called the Fitzpatrick scale. It uses this. We know how this works, okay? It's very simple. And yet, because so many people are coming up either dark brown or dark to black, with sometimes with a little bit of intermediate, like we saw with New York Man, a tiny little trace chance, little less than 5% chance of him being intermediate, but the bulk of his, you know, complexion is going to lie somewhere between dark brown and dark to black. Okay, we knew that's where a bulk of his complexion would lie. Because so many people are coming up with this, they're now trying to redefine what dark means. They'll change it and go, oh yeah, people who are olive skinned. I'm going to show you a hilarious article soon, which shows you the amount of cope that Eurocentrists are doing in the discovery of the fact that a lot of these kind of like European groups and stuff like that are coming up as essentially belonging to one of these bottom two skin complexion ranges. Now, bear in mind, we're not doing this. This is not black researchers. This is coming out from your own researchers who are concluding the fact that these people, skin complexion, like Cheddar Man, who we're going to look at in the next slide, exist in this very dark skinned range. Now, this slide, we just kind of looked at Cheddar Man himself, and I propose that this kind of reconstruction to the right is a closer estimation for what Cheddar Man probably looked like. Because if you look at his skull, and it's hard to get a really clear picture, but if you look at his skull, he has very rectangular orbits, and we've already established that that's a African trait, very large rectangular orbits, a very large nasal passage, which we know what we can see here will basically be 60% of the nose's total width. Okay, so he has quite a broad nose, so you can see from there. They didn't really make much effort to build back the top teeth, but you can kind of assume there would have been some mild prognathism there, especially since he has such a large mandible. Okay, and yeah, essentially, we know the skin is dark to black, which is why they've done him this dark. And the only thing that really sits as European on this is the choice to give him straight hair, which was not genetically based, by the way. There was no genetic argument for Cheddar Man having straight hair. That was just the choice that was made. So we kind of created this weird looking, I think, person that doesn't really reflect any modern human groups, doesn't really look like anything you would see. And I think it's probably more sensible and I just think it's more sensible to create an actual human that looks like they exist with those features. And that's what my approximation was. And another thing that leans towards that is that Cheddar Man's cephalic index is 72, making him very strongly dolichocephalic. Once again, this doesn't make him black, but we then have to speak to the rarity of a cephalic index like that being amongst modern Eurasian populations. It's going to be incredibly rare, whereas it's going to be incredibly common. You know, that's just kind of like pretty standard amongst Africans to have a cephalic index like that. So once again, these arguments just leaning towards, you know, having a more sensible, essentially what would classify in the modern day as black phenotype. Moving on. I'm not going to go into details about this. I think I've just explained Cheddar Man, the real face of Cheddar Man, blah, 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 blah. I don't think there's any such thing as a black-skinned white man, okay, which is what they've created here. Not being rude there, but that's just the fact of the matter. And no, I wouldn't classify Dravidians as black-skinned white men. I'd classify them as Dravidians. I don't think they look like this. I think the hair naturally is got a kink there, but they're just worried about introducing anything that makes them look too black. But I'm not going to go into details on that slide. So this is more about Cheddar Man. I think we've kind of like exhausted the point about Cheddar Man. And then I went into some quotes from kind of early, well, I wouldn't say early scholars kind of from the 20th century who spoke quite exhaustively, such as J.A. Rogers, Dave McRitchie, and Godfrey Higgins, who spoke quite exhaustively about the black presence in Europe. And not that it was a result of migration or immigration, but many of these black groups were found in populations. They were there before the people who arrived later. This is what a lot of historians were saying. It's something that seems to have been written out from history somewhat. So it's just worthwhile being aware of the fact that this isn't just something that people are pulling out for the sky that has no literary basis. There are lots and lots. There's lots of credible researchers who have done research and uncovered the fact that you have these large black populations that used to exist in Britain and in Western Europe as a whole that have been written out of history. Okay. And then I just spoke about kind of like a timeline. I'm going to include this. I'm going to increase this now to include the new groups that have been DNA tested. But just looking at kind of like the amount of times we keep pulling up people who are essentially black in the British Isles, starting from the Ibero-Mauritanians to the Western hunter-gatherers. We're gonna look at these in a bit of detail a little bit later. Cheddar Man, okay, the builders of the Stonehenge, like has been mentioned, Ivory Bangle Lady, who I speak about quite a lot, Beachy Head Lady. Every time they seem to do these kind of ancient or old DNA, or just kind of like digs, archaeological digs around Britain, they're constantly pulling up people who, using different forms of analysis, anthropological analysis, seem to be clustering quite consistently with black people. Okay, whether it be DNA like the latest one, or be, you know, physical traits like some of the previous ones, or, you know, the DNA looking specifically at the skin, eye color, etc. They just seem to be pulling up people who are consistent, or in the modern time we would classify them as black people. That's that's really what's quite consistent here. Okay. So hunter-gatherer populations in Europe. So this is just some of the things to be aware of. There's some quotes that I've highlighted here. So it's just, it is a further surprise that Epipaleolithic Natufian of Israel. Now I've mentioned this because we speak about the Natufians. Okay, they came to be, they tend to be brought up quite a lot when it comes to these ancestries, as do other groups like Western hunter-gatherer, etc. These groups seem to be brought up. So we're going to look at each of them in not detail, but just kind of like snapshots to see how, what we know to be true phenotypically about these various groups. So it says here, it's a further surprise that Epipaleolithic Natufian from Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, and this is Brace's study that says that. And then he has several phenotypic kind of studies that he's done looking at different traits that they have, where they consistently seem to either cluster with, either Niger Congo, or with Nubian, Bronze Age Nubians, or with ancient North Africans, such as the Taforat individual, etc. So they seem to always cluster with essentially black Africans. Okay, here we see him clustering between prehistoric Northeast Africans and Niger Congo. We see Natufian sitting in the middle there, etc. We then looked at Beachy Head Lady and the Eurocentric coping, which I'm not going to go into too much, but the brief overview I'm going to give is that essentially when Beachy Head Lady's skull was found, it was unanimously pretty much agreed that she had phenotypic traits that are consistent with black Africans. Okay, phenotypic traits consistent with black Africans. This was a black African skull that they were looking at. They knew that it had black African features. Now that was initially. They then did the DNA test, as we spoke about, and the DNA test came back Greek. Okay, by the way, Greek with anomalous, I think you guys remember the anomalous African parts that they didn't want to speak about, but essentially they came back Greek. And as a result of coming back Greek, they then decided she wasn't sub-Saharan anymore. Well, she wasn't sub-Saharan to begin with. Okay, she was black. This is what you'll see they do. They don't want to cope with the fact that someone can be black and European. They don't want to have that discussion. They don't want to cope with the fact that the first people perhaps to carry this DNA or these markers that they classify as being European and therefore white were actually black people, and they've inherited those traits from a black population. That's the discussion that they don't want to have. Okay, and you'll remember that you might not remember, but let's have a look at this that I pulled up to you. This is Neguinho de Beija Flor, who's a Brazilian singer. This man, who I think you would agree from the pictures is a very black man. Okay, this would be the kind of guy, uncle you've got, who's like yeah, this is, you know, he might be the chief. This is the kind of guy who would sit quite nicely as chief of the village if you're a Niger, you know, if you're an African. This is a proper no holds barred, you know, very, very black man. There's no one who would estimate that this guy has any mixed ancestry. This guy's DNA is 67% European ancestry. Only 30% of his ancestry relates to Africa. So what do you do with that? You got a guy who more than 2/3 of his DNA is coming up European. Therefore, he should be approximating as white, but he's black, and not just black, very black, super black. Okay. So there's no questions about this. This is, once again, you have to deal with the fact that having someone can have these markers and this DNA that they've laid claim to, and they've tried to equate to, meaning that someone belongs to a certain race, is incorrect. Okay. Because the first people who would have carried those traits very likely would have been black people. Okay, it's very likely they would have been black people. So this is a nice little instant debunk to anyone who wants to say, oh, well, we found this person and blah blah blah. Their DNA was North African and Levantine, therefore they weren't black. It's like, well, oops, whoopsie. There you go. That's not going to work. Okay, and I guarantee you, more testing in different parts of Africa and different parts of the world with black populations is only going to bring out more and more of these kinds of individuals who are genetically consistent with the populations perhaps that they live in, but are phenotypically clearly black and probably have black ancestry going back as far as you can reach. So that's where the big question marks rise up. So BG Head Lady proves, so that's the one we were looking at earlier. This one spoken about here, who was classified as being Greek. And BG Head Lady proves people who are 100% black and 100% Eurasian according to modern DNA interpretation. Maybe that should say exist at the end. Let's put the word exist. I can't remember. I'm not sure exactly what that sentence was supposed to say, but that's what it proves. Okay, you're saying, well, she's Greek, she's not African, but she's black. You can't argue with her blackness because she's physiognomically black. She's got black feature sets. Everything about her features is African. Okay, so you have to now deal with the fact that having European DNA doesn't disqualify someone from being black. Okay, that's what's quite clear here. So I've got some quotes there, but I'm not going to go through them because, like I said, we've done this live stream before. If you want to go back and watch the more full version of this live stream, you're welcome to. I'm just kind of breezing through this. Ivory Bangle lady we spoke about before. This is a woman who, when they came across their skull, they had no doubt whatsoever that this was a black person. Okay. You can just look at the skull anywhere and just look at the features of it. This was a black person, someone who is phenotypically consistent with people who we would classify as black Africans. Now, because they don't like saying black, they classified her as North African. Oh, she's North African. There is no evidence that she was of North African ancestry other than the fact she was craniofacially and skeletally black. So they know by saying she's North African, they've kind of qualified for the African part, all right? And that kind of, between themselves, they'll be like, yeah, there's some black people in North Africa. But then they know the general public has got to hear North African and think, oh, well, that means she's kind of like one of those pale brown Arabs, doesn't it? So this is the sneaky kind of thing they do where they'll switch. What they should be saying is that she is craniofacially consistent with black Africans. This is what they should have said, but they won't say that. Okay, and it would be very interesting to see what Ivory Bangle lady's DNA would come back looking like. I know they did an isotope analysis on her, and obviously that just came back saying that she essentially was, you know, local. You know, she ate like the locals, so she was, for all intents and purposes, she was very much British, much like the people who we're going to come on to. But she was craniofacially consistent with black people. Okay, so they had to accept the fact that they were dealing with a black person skeleton here. I think the film might have been a little bit more honest back then. I think if they found an Ivory Bangor lady now, they'd get Carolyn Wilkinson on the job and they'd make some kind of weird space-faced European. I think that's what they'd do. They probably would have changed their mind now, especially with Beachy Head Lady as well, I reckon. But anyway, there's also the Neanderthal dilemma that we speak about, the fact that a lot of these groups that are kind of like these kind of old basal groups to the European continent don't carry Neanderthal ancestry, and the only people who reflect that in modern times are Black people. So it's a bit of a dilemma for them. Okay. And then I spoke about the recent deception where they've basically said Africans carry a surprising amount of Neanderthal DNA. And what they essentially did once again is they used their good old trusty North African population. So the North African population, who we know is largely populated by people from the Black Sea region as a result of the Black Sea slave trade, the Barbary corsairs, several introgressions that have just been taking place over the past couple thousand years from the Eastern European region into North Africa, which has kind of created this kind of mixed race group of people across North Africa who currently obviously rule it. We know that that's the case. We know about these introgressions. They're written about. There's very clear historical data telling us about why North Africa looks the way it does. They've used that population and said, oh, well, look, they carry loads of Neanderthal DNA. Therefore, Africans aren't clean from Neanderthal DNA as we thought they were. Once again, just playing with semantics, playing with populations, doing things that people know are ultimately dishonest, but hey, they can because they can, I guess. So this is the kind of deception that they're kind of working with at the moment. We won't go any further than that. So this is where we ended off, and this is where we're going to continue on. How long did that take? That preamble took about half an hour. That was quite long, but at least now we can kind of move on. I think that was a bit necessary. So deception in anthropology and genetic studies. So I speak about the Max Planck Institute being at the forefront of disinformation and racism, okay, in the interpretation of human history. In other words, weaponizing genetics to deceive people. Now, my slide ended there previously, but now I've done a bit of research and I've kind of added to it because I feel like one of the great things is over the past few weeks, you guys know that I wrote and released that paper. It's a very, very brief paper. It's like 5 pages long. But I wrote and released that paper just talking about how genetics is being used deceptively. It's very brief. It's very short. And I did that deliberately because I'm drafting a longer paper, but I'm very aware of the fact that I'm not a geneticist, guys. Okay, so I'm not trying to sound too scientific and I'm not trying to get into a deep scientific argument. I want to partner with people who are qualified in the area to be able to make a robust argument, which is why I'm only done a very brief paper at the moment. But let me give you my conclusions. And I think these are all very defensible. In fact, the conclusions I'm giving you have been fielded from other papers. There are multiple papers out there that talk about these issues. There's a paper by LaChance written in 2013, a paper by Sengupta written in 2023, and they all say these same things. So let me give you the 5 reasons why or how they are using genetics to reframe history. I'll just read through this very briefly. First of all, data collection, which I've spoken about already. Many African regions remain vastly undersampled, especially in the Sahel, Nile Valley, and Central Africa. This remains the case in spite of significant excess in genomic diversity seen on the African continent. And for those of you who don't know, Africans carry 25 to 30% more SNP markers than our Eurasian counterparts. So essentially, we have 25 to 30% more markers than people in Europe. Okay, this is something that's known. There should be not only an additional, but almost another separate tier when it comes to sampling and analyzing African DNA. But let me carry on anyway. Geneticists consistently agree requires more. So we require more testing, not less sampling on the continent to compensate for. So the fact that we're much more diverse means we need much more sampling. This is not been addressed yet. That brings us on to number two, genotyping arrays. Now, genotyping arrays are essentially these databases they set up, which basically say these are the important SNPs, or these are the important markers you need to look out for. Nothing else matters. So essentially, it's a big filtration system that decides what's important for people to look at when they're analyzing DNA. And it says here, SNP panels or SNP panels modeled on Eurasian variety. So all of the SNP panels that are being used, particularly the ones used in ancient DNA studies, have been modeled on variety found in Eurasians, which is not a lot, because essentially they're all very recently related. So all of that other variety that Africans have, it totally ignores. So therefore, what happens is that these studies end up being biased to only see Eurasian variety. That's all it's looking for. It's not looking for diversity amongst Africans. Next, reference populations. Key African groups are often missing from QPADM or FSTAT models, leading to substitution by Eurasian proxies. So in other words, another thing they do is they deliberately either omit Africans or only include African groups they know won't cluster close to their target. We've spoke about this before, and therefore will cluster closer to the Eurasians for the simple fact that they're only looking at Eurasian markers anyway. So they're only looking for stuff that Eurasians have anyway. So it's a very clever exercise of loading their references in from different populations, which they've selected very carefully to make sure that essentially Africa doesn't come out the winner. All right, this is basically what they do. This guy here, Johannes Kraus on the side, he's a master at this. He knows exactly what he's doing. He does this all the time. Next, analytic tools. Tools like QPADM, PCA, and outgroup statistics are sensitive to reference panels. So once again, going back to these very Eurasian selection of markers that they look out for. And to be clear, one of the marker panels that they use is called 1240K. They also use another one called Twist. Okay, so this is what a lot of ancient DNA studies use. 1240K is called 1240K because it looks at 1.24 million SNPs. Every human being has tens of millions of SNPs. So you can imagine how much they're filtering out. They're filtering out more than 90%, saying, hey, it's useless. But that's because Eurasians have got a very small window of variety. Africans have a massive window of variety. And if you don't look at it all, what you get is false positives and false negatives as well. Okay. And then finally, narrative framing. So conclusions frequently lead toward Eurasian-centric storylines reinforced by methodological reference limitations. So in other words, they'll enter these studies trying to prove a narrative that they already have. If you enter a study and you believe all Black people are slaves and any presence of Black people in Europe, for instance, is a result of slavery, your genetics testing won't rule that out. It will just find a way of working that storyline in. So because of these false narratives they feed into these studies, you end up with a false reinforcement of what was a false idea to begin with. If they entered these studies thinking, well, Black people were the nobility of Europe and were the higher class of the nobles, okay, they would find or be able to find evidence for that as well. But they don't look for that. Okay, and this is what's important. They don't look for it that way. It's all about which way you're approaching it. So these 5 kind of key things I find are frequent and repeating traits of the studies that they hand to us. Okay, let me give a shout out to James Stewart. He says, notice that where Africans are darker in the north is consistent with where the Africans strong enough to repel the Islamic invaders, Nubia and Angola. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good observation. I always talk about that, to flip that in reverse and to actually substantiate the point that you've made there. I've spoken about the fact that sub-Saharan, as we all know, isn't a thing. Okay, The whole idea of black people being limited below the Sahara, which isn't true, by the way, because black people are the only people in the Sahara. So we're inside the Sahara and beneath the Sahara. What you have along the coastlines of North Africa are coastal Africans who are by and large restricted by the Sahara because they are not phenotypically adapted to survive further south than the Sahara itself. So you have these coastal Africans. So rather than having this idea of sub-Saharans, that should just be scrapped. You should either be classified as an African or a coastal North African. That's what I call the modern populations of North Africa who are lighter skinned or fairer skinned. I call them coastal North Africans. That makes sense in terms of how much they've managed to basically get inside the African continent, but also their very clear and very real restriction of the Sahara and the Saharan climate, which they're not able to essentially cross, whereas black people are able to, traverse the Sahara quite easily. So you have coastal North Africans and Africans. That's what I call those populations. So if you're African, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't matter where on the continent you are. Black African is black African. You're African, you're black. There's no sub-Sahara. But then you have coastal North Africans who are restricted just to the coast. So that's a really good point there, James. Thank you for contributing that. Okay. So now that we've had a look at those arguments, let's have a quick, brief look at some grade A level cope. I thought this article was quite funny. In fact, I'm going to come back to this because we're 40 minutes in and we haven't touched on the topic. So as funny as the article is, and I do want to come back to it because it's really good for us to have a little bit of a laugh when we do these. Let's actually dive in to the article at hand. Okay, let's dive into the article at hand. So this is what you're tuned in for. Geneticists reluctantly admit sub-Saharan ancestry exists in England. I think if I was going to finish that sentence, that's what I would say. Okay, so let's have a look at a few articles together, and then after we've looked at these few articles together, we'll kind of dive in to the studies themselves and see what's actually being communicated here, because it's important we have kind of like a relatively broad understanding of what's taking place here. I don't know. So to answer Smelly's question here, do I believe Neanderthals came out of Africa? I don't know. I'm hearing the arguments being made about Neanderthals possibly being in Africa first. And there's that kind of ghost DNA argument who go back. I don't know. Is my honest answer to that. I have no idea, but it's an interesting question. I'm sure it has an interesting answer, but I'll have some papers to read before I can make a statement on that. So let me quickly find the articles. I've got them all saved in a window. I'm just trying to remember where that is. I think it's here. Yeah, here it is. So let's start here. So we'll just go through a couple of like the website, which just give us the news and the headlines and the kind of like the buzzwords that everyone's been feeding on. And then after we've read a couple of these articles, we'll dive into the study itself and just get a more broader, deeper understanding of exactly what's gone on with these latest discoveries. Okay, so 1,300-year-old skeletons found in England had grandparents from sub-Saharan Africa, DNA studies reveal. Okay, we know at the moment we can't stop them from using sub-Saharan, but I think we have to start that campaign. That would be really good. Okay, a DNA analysis of two people who lived in Britain in the 7th century reveals they had recent African ancestry. So here's a picture of one of the skeletons. I believe this is Uptown Girl. So close that. Grave 47 at Uptown Cemetery in Kent, England, contained an adolescent girl with recent African ancestry. So please remember grave 47. We basically, her short name was going to be Uptown Girl from here in, because of the name of her cemetery. Now, two people who lived in England during early Middle Ages had recent sub-Saharan African ancestry, likely from a grandparent, a new DNA analysis reveals. Now, here's what's important here. It's two people. And these two people are not related, to be very, very clear. Okay, these two people are not related, and they will find it in completely separate grave sites that were in different parts of coastal England. Okay, so these people were not related. They just happen to have the same, or roughly the same amount of sub-Saharan ancestry as each other, which is, I would say, bizarre. But is it bizarre? Let's look into it and see how bizarre that actually is. But I think some people may have read it, and the way the article comes across, it tries to almost make it sound like they're related, like there maybe was one sub-Saharan, one lone African who came along, Nigerian probably, and spread his seed. But that wasn't the case. Okay, we definitely have two separate situations that are contemporaneous with each other, which once again leads me to believe that then argues for probably a broader spread and a broader reach of that kind of, maybe there's a group, or maybe there's a couple of cities, who knows how many people carry this kind of ancestry in those times. It's quite interesting. But anyways, two people. The DNA shows that there is human as well as material connection, and that it extends into West Africa. Study co-author Duncan Sayer, a historical archaeologist at the University of Lancashire and UK, told Live Science. This is interesting. He says material connection that extends into West Africa. I didn't read any of that. Most of it just sounded really British, but I maybe missed that. Maybe we'll pick that up in a study. But that's interesting. Archaeologists discovered the burial of an adolescent girl in Updown Cemetery in Kent, and the burial of a young man at Worth Matravers Cemetery in Dorset. That sounds really American, Worth Matravers. Anyway, both cemeteries located in southern Britain were dated to the 7th century, after the fall of the Roman Empire, when Anglo-Saxon peoples occupied the island. Okay. DNA analysis of 5 people buried at Updown and 18 people buried at Worth Matravers found that most of these individuals had Northern European or Western British and Irish ancestry. Now, I'm going to highlight that here, because this is what I was talking about earlier when I said what they're going to try and do is use sub-Saharan as a proxy for black. And this is where the big sell comes in. Oh, all of the rest of their ancestry and everyone else. There's 23 people sampled. 2 of them pull up a relatively sizable proportion of, let's say, Nigerian ancestry, for want of a better argument. Okay, because I think we can all agree that it's probably Nigerians. Let's be honest with you. If you're gonna find any, I'm just checking. All right, but West African ancestry. 2 of them have relatively sizable amounts. The other 21 of them have European ancestry. And notice here, they said here, Northern European, Western British, and Irish ancestry. So straight away, everyone's head's going to be thrown, oh, well, they're just white. So these people are probably just like little octoroons, a couple of little octoroons, who you know, have a little bit of kink to their hair, you know, small amount, you know, I got a cousin who's quarter black, you know, that kind of thing. That's kind of what we're being pushed here. But I have to stress, okay, sub-Saharan is not proxy for black. A lot of these people, these other people who didn't put up any sub-Saharan African DNA, would have been the furthest thing from being pure white. And many of them might also have been black. And I am going to qualify that, guys. I am going to qualify that. I'm not just saying that. I'm going to qualify that. You're going to see the feeder groups, when we look at the study, the various feeder groups, all have got lots of studies that suggest that they are dark skinned, okay, dark to black skin, these same groups that we're talking about. So a lot of this other ancestry, which they've just broadly classified as Northern European, Western British, and Irish ancestry, knowing that people are going to assume, oh, well, there was basically Celtics, you know, thinking redhead Celts, is not necessarily the case. Let's carry on. But when they sequenced the DNA of the girl buried at grave 47 Updown, they realized her ancestry came from an entirely different continent. In 2 published So in 2 studies published Wednesday, it's really interesting actually. They have 2 studies, 1 study for each of the individuals, and it's kind of weird because both studies are kind of the same, or they're very similar, but they've just, anyways, it's an interesting thing because they've sampled 23 people, I think, in total, but they've only released studies on these 2 people because they had an interesting story. The other 21 people, apparently their story wasn't interesting enough to do a study on, which I found quite amusing. In 2 studies published Wednesday, August the 13th, in the journal Antiquity, researchers detailed the unusual genetic backgrounds of the girl from Updown and the young man from Worth Matravers. Analysis of the young people's mitochondrial DNA. So guys, we know what mitochondrial DNA is. That's your DNA that you inherit from your mother, and it goes down your maternal line. So that leads to a single maternal ancestor, okay, which is passed from mother to child. Revealed that both had mothers who were likely from Northern Europe. So we have a maternal line that traces somewhere in Europe. But their autosomal DNA, so autosomal is your whole DNA, which kind of shows all your ancestry, but is subject to recombination. Okay, so your entire DNA shows, but at every generation you have recombination, where basically your genetics has to choose how much it's going to take from one side of your ancestry versus the other. So you can get, by the time basically you get 2 generations down, you could have one of your grandparents completely erased from your ancestry in your autosome, depending on how the recombinations take place. So it's quite interesting. But anyway, we have the autosomal DNA, which comes from chromosomes that do not code for biological sex, showed clear signs of non-European ancestry. So it's really important that to get a full picture of someone's ancestry, you need the autosomes. It's impossible. Otherwise, you're just getting a single male ancestor through Y-DNA and a single female ancestor through mitochondrial DNA, but all that stuff in the middle that makes up who you are, that's lost. So luckily we have the autosomal DNA here, and we're able to get a full picture of who this individual is. Shout out to Nata8697. He says, salute King's Monologue, and to the chat, salute to you, and thank you for your Swedish krona. See, I remember what that is now. I appreciate it very much. Thank you very much. Let's carry on. Both individuals thus show genetically and geographically mixed descent, and had an estimated 20 to 40% ancestry characteristic of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I do think they've played a bit of games here when I read the paper. They're kind of ruling out the idea, because straight away I was thinking, well, that could be a couple of mixed race parents. There's kind of different routes you could get to have that kind of ancestry without having a single ancestor. And I feel like they've played a little bit of, I don't know. I just feel like they've played a little bit of games to get the result that they wanted, to say it was a single ancestor, because they want to minimize the impact or the likelihood of there being a lot of Nigerians or a lot of West Africans in Britain. But we'll come on to that and you'll see that. Had an estimated 20 to 40% ancestry characteristic of sub-Saharan Africa, Sayer and colleagues wrote in the study. Updown girls' DNA had affinity to that of present-day Yoruba, Mende, Mandinka, Esan groups, the team found. Now, I'm not sure if I could find it, but one of the things I'm keeping my eyes out for is the SMP panel that they use, because of what I stated earlier. I'm now very aware and very cognizant. Are they doing whole genome sequencing, or are they running it through these Eurocentric panels? And one of the panels that throws up Yoruba quite a lot is the 1000 genomes panel, because Yoruba is kind of like a super group. So as soon as I see Yoruba, I think, oh, maybe they're using the 1000 genomes panel. And I couldn't see it in the study. Maybe when we read through it together, I missed something. We'll pick up which panel they're using. But this is something that I kind of want to express. I want all of you guys to be aware of now. When these genetic tests come out, go straight to the panel, okay? And they should either not be using the panel, be using whole genome sequencing, or they should be using specific African panels that deal with broader DNA, such as, I think there's an AGR panel and there's another one called TopMed. These are panels that have been proven to give better results, fairer results when it comes to testing African populations. The ones that they use at the moment are almost notorious for erasing African data. So when you got studies like the latest Neurat Man one, where they ran it through 1240K, they knew exactly the outcome they was going to get. They erased all of his African data. That's kind of how it works. So just be aware of that. Based on a statistical model, the researchers proposed that both people had a grandparent with African ancestry, possibly from similar groups that left sub-Saharan Africa between mid-6th and early 7th centuries. Now, this possibly from similar groups, okay, that they didn't evidence that at all when I read the paper. So once again, this is me leaning on the fact that they want the Yoruba that impregnated Uptown Girl's grandparent, and the one that impregnated Fort Waivers or whatever it's called. I can't remember what it's called. The other guy's grandparent. They really want them to be related, because then they can say, "Oh, single group of Nigerian merchants came along and had some fun." All right, they don't have to deal with there being actual populations or perhaps large scale, migration of Nigerians or West Africans into Britain. So just keep your eye out for this kind of language that's being used. The fact these individuals were buried with their community suggests they were valued by peers, the authors wrote in the study. Okay. And once again, that's a little subtle nod there to, oh, well, they were buried in a very respectful way, so they weren't slaves. No one thought they were slaves. And if you're instantly thinking, and if your mind straight away went to slavery, then that shows you what a job our history and our curriculum has done to you. There should be zero inclination that there's any relation to slavery with any of these individuals. Okay. The Uptown Girl was buried with a knife, a spoon, a bone comb near her left hip, and a decorated pot from Frankish Gaul at her feet. I'd probably need to look in a supplementary data. I'd like to see what that comb looks like, because that would be interesting. Because technically, if they're saying these people are 1/4 African, their hair shouldn't have that much kink to it if all these other people were, white, like they're assuming. But if these groups, like I'm suggesting, and I'm thinking, maybe we're all melanated anyway, it'll be interesting to see what that comb looks like. Bone combs are almost always Afro combs, so that'll be interesting. DNA analysis has also revealed that she had biological relatives in the same cemetery. The Worth Matravers young man, on the other hand, was buried in a double grave with an older man he was not biologically related to. Tracy Prowse, a bioarchaeologist at Macalester University in Ontario, who was not involved in the studies, told Life Science in an email that the researchers do a good job of discussing the historical evidence for trade between parts of Africa and northern countries. Given previous discoveries of diverse individuals dating back to the Roman Empire, including the Ivory Bangle Lady found in York. Now, bear in mind, Ivory Bangle Lady was designated as Black African based on her physiognomy, not on genetic evidence, who may have had North African ancestry. That is not suggested at all in any. That's just the cope that the media made. Okay, she has African ancestry because she's Black. That's it. But she could have just been Black European. Once again, this is one of these things here. But anyway, let's carry on. The presence of these individuals at Uptown and Worth Matravers in the 7th century Britain isn't terribly surprising. But that's a nice quote to hear, because it at least sounds like there's this adjustment being made where people are accepting the fact, hey, Black people been here. It's kind of like step one. We're almost making a little bit of progress there. But Sayah does not think there is continuity between the Roman period and people with African ancestry in the 7th century. In the 7th century, people found in southern Britain. So once again, this is interesting, because the people who actually conducting the study, they don't want that continuity, because that would be I guess the logical leap that first researcher is saying is that, okay, the Romans came over, a load of them were African, okay, and a load of them stayed, okay, and as a result you have this African ancestry kind of like working its way through Britain for several hundred years following the arrival of these Romans. But then that would have to admit, hey, the Romans had, you know, black, perhaps West African people in nobility, in positions of in positions of high nobility. Okay, they don't want to introduce. Hey, Ivory Bangle lady was North African. All right, North African. We won't say where in North Africa. We won't give you a country. We won't say Moroccan or Algerian. We'll just say North African, anywhere but the Sahara or Sub-Sahara. That's what she must be. So you can see how there's this kind of like guardedness in terms of whether or not this person ends up being a part of that, well, I say initial, that kind of wave of Africans that came with the Romans. They don't want that to be related. After the Germanic Vandals sacked Rome in AD 455, they founded a kingdom in North Africa. But then the Byzantine Empire conquered them in AD 534. Not sure how that relates. At the end of the Roman period, North Africa was conquered by the Vandals, Sayer said. It is the reconquest in the middle 6th century AD, around 533 to 535, which seems to be the significant event here. So I don't know what he's suggesting there. The DNA data showing African ancestry is unexpected but congruent with archaeological and historical evidence. The researchers wrote in the study and is shedding new light on the early medieval period in Britain. I don't know, maybe one of you can help me, but I don't know what he's implying here regarding, maybe just saying they're unrelated. And because Rome was sacked, I don't know. That one went over my head a bit, I'm going to be totally honest with you. Okay, so there's that article in Live Science. Hope you guys are following along quite well. Let's carry on. Yeah, so this is in the Independent. This is a bit of a briefer one, but it's good for us to get a view of how the more newsy, the Independent's not a tabloid. I was going to say tabloid, but strictly speaking, Independent's not a tabloid. It's a broadsheet. But anyway, let's see how the news outlets are covering this. So it says DNA recovered from skeletons buried in a 7th century cemetery on the south coast of England has revealed that the buried individuals had West African ancestry, raising further questions about early medieval migrations to Europe. Archaeologists document significant migration during this period into England from continental northern Europe, with historical accounts describing the settlement of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. However, the extent of movement from further afield has remained unclear. To further understand early medieval migrations in Europe, researchers performed DNA analysis of the individuals buried in 2 7th century cemeteries on England's south coast at Updown, Kent, and Worth Matravers, Dorset. The findings, published in 2 studies in General Antiquity, show clear signs of non-European ancestry in 2 buried individuals with an affinity to present-day groups living in sub-Saharan West Africa. While most of the individuals buried at the cemeteries had either Northern European or Western British and Irish ancestry, so once again, saying that same line. So I don't know if that was maybe a part of the press release, okay? Because that line isn't really, from what I saw, isn't entirely correct, because we'll look at the ancestry that makes up the rest. One person at each cemetery had a recent ancestor from West Africa, scientists said. Kent has always been a conduit for influence from the adjacent continent, and this was particularly marked in the 6th century. What might be termed Kent's Frankish phase, said Duncan Sayer, an author of one of the studies from the University of Lancashire. Updown is also located near Royal Centre of Fingalsham, indicating that these connections were part of a wider royal network, Dr. Sayer added. Okay. In contrast, Dorset was on the fringes of continental influence, researchers said. Okay, so there's one location that seems to be very much in the center of kind of international trade, but then we have Dorset, which seems to be in contrast to that, doesn't seem to have much international influx, which is suggestive then that this is a more settled population or a more local population, so it can't maybe be as easily explained away as them being maybe merchants or something who have just come. The archaeological evidence suggests a marked and notable cultural divide between Dorset and areas to the west, and Anglo-Saxon influenced areas to the east, said Cur I'm not even going to try and say that name. Keardwin J. Edwards, one of the authors of the study from the University of Huddersfield. The individuals showed clear signs of non-European ancestry and an affinity with present-day Yoruba, Mende, blah, 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 SN groups from sub-Saharan West Africa, the study noted. Further DNA analysis revealed that they were of mixed descent, with each having one paternal grandparent from West Africa. So they're saying that each of them just happens to have a West African grandparent. Okay, I'm still not fully on board with that. I'll let you see their kind of reasoning behind that. I think there's reason to suggest there's other routes we can get there. The up-down grave was found to contain several goods, including a pot, most likely imported from Frankish Gaul, and a spoon, hinting at the individual's Christian faith or connection with the Byzantine Empire. I'm sure she had a knife as well. Yeah. The cemetery was part of Kent's royal network, and these grave goods and genetic indicators point to the region's continental connections, the study noted. The other individual at the Worth Machever's gravesite was buried alongside a male with British ancestry and an anchor made of local limestone. The fact that individuals are buried along with typical members of their communities indicate they were valued locally, archaeologists noted. What is fascinating about these two individuals is the international connection is found in both east and west of Britain, says Dr. Sayer. So once again, this is people who are geographically distant, not necessarily right next to each other. Updown is right in the center of early Anglo-Saxon cultural zone, and Worth Machever's, by contrast, is right outside its periphery on the sub-Roman west, he explained. The findings, according to researchers, raise further questions about long-distance movement and demographic interaction in Britain during early Middle Ages. Our joint results emphasize the cosmopolitan nature in the early medieval period, pointing to a diverse population with far-flung connections who were nonetheless fully integrated into the fabric of daily life, Dr. Edwards concluded. Okay, I think that's the end. Yeah, that is the end. Brilliant. And let me give a shout out to Stephen Carter, who, yeah, thank you very much for your $40 donation, man. It's much appreciated. Appreciate that very much. Yeah, so there you go. 2 articles down now. And I think at that point we can dive into the papers. But before we dive into the papers, I just want to kind of like go back to my slideshow and go over some of the points that I think I've pulled out that I think are worth kind of looking at and recapping. So geneticists reluctantly admit sub-Saharan ancestry. 2 people who lived in England during the early Middle Ages had recent sub-Saharan ancestry, likely from a grandparent, a new DNA analysis reveals, and that's from Life Science. Now, this is from the papers themselves. Both individuals thus show genetically and geographically mixed descent and had an estimated 20 to 40% ancestry characteristic of sub-Saharan Africa. This is from the article, once again, the Life Science article. Sayer and his colleagues wrote in the study, Updown Girl's DNA had affinity to that of present-day Yoruba. So I spoke about that already, excuse me. And then based on the statistical model, the researcher proposed that both people had a grandparent with African ancestry, possibly from similar groups. Once again, I'm going to stress that possibly from similar groups is not really supported. It's more of a, well, you know, they're both Nigerian or they're both West African. So it is possible they're from similar groups, but we're not really going to substantiate that with data. That left sub-Saharan Africa between mid and 6th, early 7th century. Okay, now, her African ancestry may or may not have been visible in aspects of hair type. So this is stuff we're going to come across in the study. Okay. In fact, yeah, I'm going to read this now. So this is one of the things it says in the study. It says her African ancestry may or may not have been visible in aspects of her hair type, facial features, and skin tone. Her skull is only partially intact, limiting the scope of metrical correlates of her ancestry. So I want to just highlight this top sentence. I'm going to read it again to you guys. And I'm going to ask you a question about what are the implications of this statement. It says this statement on the study itself. I'm going to make it a bit bigger so you guys can see it. Will it let me? No, let me leave it as is. Okay, so it says her African ancestry may or may not have been visible in aspects of hair type, facial features, and skin tone. Someone tell me, what are the implications there? Because this is quite important that we tackle this kind of language that's being used in these studies, because there's implications there. Now, obviously, it's saying may or may not. It's written in academic speak, so I appreciate that. But what is it? What is it that's being implied here? I want to see if anyone could pick up on that. Yeah, I think a few people are saying it. Okay, so I think Wesker was quick off the mark. He said mixed. Wildflower said she looked white, is what's being implied, or she was amongst whites. And my ancestors went from South America to you. Okay, cool. So I think I'll leave it at that, or that she's not black. So basically, what the way I read this is that if they're saying her African ancestry may have been visible, or may not have been, because obviously it's academic, well, may have been visible in aspects of her hair, facial features, and skin tone. They're saying that anybody of Nigerian descent would likely have stood out like a sore thumb. They're basically saying this person who is of mixed, they're all, by the way, all of the samples that came up have got mixed ancestry from these different ancestral European groups, which we're going to look at in a moment. But this 20 to 40% Yoruba ancestry or West African ancestry may have been visible. So the implication they're giving everyone is that everyone else was white. To me, that's the only way you can read that. Because if this person had Yoruba ancestry, okay, and she was found in, I don't know, let's say the Western Sahara, okay, they probably wouldn't have made that claim. I would say they might not have even made that claim if someone had 20 to 40% ancestry and they were found in ancient Egypt, as racist as they are. They wouldn't have made that claim. They would have just assumed, oh, well, she's, you know, she's going to look like the locals. But the fact that they said, oh, well, you know, this might have been, you know, she might have stood out. They're basically saying, yeah, these people, they're all Celts. She's amongst a bunch of Celts. So it's very deliberate choice of language that's being used there. Okay. And I get they have to make these kind of observations, but it does give you a good look into their mindset and being how knowledgeable they should be of the phenotypic range of these contributing groups that made up the rest of them. This is something that I found a bit surprising. Let's read the next one. It says the discovery of two recent sub-Saharan ancestry for the discovery of recent sub-Saharan ancestry for two individuals who died and were buried as ostensibly typical members of their communities around the middle and 7th century as separate sites in southern England adds a new dimension to data on long distance movement and demographic interaction involving Britain. So that's just another key quote that I pulled out there. I'm gonna be totally honest with you, I don't even know why I pulled that quote out. But let's carry on. All right, we're going to get to the study soon, but I just want to pull out a few things. So geneticists reluctantly admit sub-Saharan ancestry. So geneticists, this is some of the conclusions that I've made. Now, these aren't quotes. These are things that I'm saying. So first of all, geneticists reluctantly admit sub-Saharan ancestry to deny wider reaching Black ancestry in ancient Britons. My gut feeling, and I could be wrong in this, but my gut feeling is that this study is a response to the overwhelming and somewhat snowballing evidence of Black ancestry across Britons. I think there's an impact being made by people are by, you know, discoveries like Cheddar Man and these ancient kind of ancestral groups in Europe, them discovering that you run them through the high-risk plex model net, they keep coming back either black or dark. This is going to have an effect. And I feel like this is kind of like an effort to reclaim and say, yeah, there was some black. There was a little bit of black, but only a couple of people, you know. You can't possibly claim that the builders of the Stonehenge were black. There was barely anyone there. We had Nigerians did start coming, but they only started coming in 7th century. Do you kind of see how this dialogue works? This is how they kind of like work it into it. Once again, you use sub-Saharan as a proxy. Okay, sub-Saharan as a proxy for black. That's exactly what's being done here. Black is only present in the sub-Saharans. All this other ancestry, which we're going to look through now together, that can't possibly be black. Cheddar Man was not sub-Saharan, but he was black. Okay, that's just, it's been proven. Okay, Cheddar Man was black, but he was not sub-Saharan. Okay, there's nothing in his ancestry that suggests that he was of sub-Saharan ancestry, but he was black. So where do you place that? Where do you place that? This chart to the right, which I think you guys can barely make out. I'm just going to quickly get rid of that comment on the screen, excuse me. So this chart to the right, which I think you can barely make out, shows the admixture. So this is an admixture analysis of the genetics of all the people in these 2 grave sites. This is all, I think, 23 of them in total. Okay. Now, the 2 ones with that little yellow dash, this is our Uptown gal at the bottom over here. And this is our Fort or whatever, Waver. I can never pronounce that thing. But this is our dude up here. So this is our girl down here, this is our dude up there. And that little yellow tab is the Yoruba ancestry. But I don't want you to just look at the Yoruba ancestry. I want you to look at the rest of this ancestry, because we're going to kind of go through it, each one. All right. We're going to look through each of these different ancestries. And we're going to see, is it a case that the Yoruba or the West African ancestry, the yellow part, is the only place that we could have had, you know, black or melanated ancestry? Or could it have come from any of these other areas? So let's have a look. So we have, let's start with the blue. Most of the sample comprises of 3 main components, characteristic of Western European hunter-gatherers in blue. So the blue is Western European hunter-gatherers or Western hunter-gatherers. WHG. I think some of you will be familiar with these groups. We're going to look at each of these groups separately. The next one is early European farmers, okay, which is green. That group's called EEF. So we have WHG, we have EEF in green, and Caucasus hunter-gatherers in red. So those are our 3 groups. And you can see the largest pretty much across the board is this blue one, which is European hunter-gatherers. Now, we're going to put aside the fact that they probably run this through one of these biased Eurocentric S&P panels. We're going to put that aside, but we're just going to look at the data at hand that we have. So it says a KD10, that's our guy, and East 003, that's our up-down girl, stand out as the only individuals with a substantial yellow component, characteristic of West African populations. Smaller components are likely artifacts of DNA degradation. So all of these little smaller ones, these little orange ones and these light green ones, they've written these off and they said, oh, they're probably incorrect. These are the major groups that they're focusing on. Okay. So we're all clear on that. Let's proceed. So let's look at these groups. So Ibero-Mauritians, first of all, shared about 2/3 of their DNA or genetic ancestry with Natufians, hunter-gatherers who lived in the Middle East from 14,500 to 11,000 years ago, and 1/3 with sub-Saharan Africans, who are most closely related to West Africans and the Hadza of Tanzania. Okay, so Ibero-Mauritians, 2/3 Natufians, 1/3 sub-Saharans. Let's look at Natufians. So I'd say at least 1/3 we're going to agree is definitely black, and then the 2/3 Natufians. Are Natufians black? Well, let's have a look. Direct source for, and Natufians are a direct source for early European farmers, a direct source. Okay, so this is one of the feeding groups that make up early European farmers, which you saw was one of the major groups here. It says the Tufians share ancestry with Ibero-Mauritanians, and they consistently cluster with Niger-Congo. So this is on a physical level. So the Tufians on a physical level looked either like Niger-Congo or Nubians, or somewhere between those groups and near and early North Africans. In other words, they physically consistently cluster alongside Africans. Let's move on. Western hunter-gatherers, that's WHG, and I think that's our major contributor, isn't it? Yeah, that's the blue one. So the blue stripe here, Western hunter-gatherers. La Bragna, okay, 7000 BP, carried the ancestral dark skin associated alleles at major pigmentation loci, with blue-eyed variant at HERC2. Okay, so we have one study that brings up La Bragna and suggests dark skin. Cheddar man, who is also WHG, Western hunter-gatherer, we already know he had dark to black skin and the blue eyes as well. And it says here, SLC245A and SLC45A2 are the strongest known contributors to light skin in Europe. These alleles rise sharply after the Mesolithic, largely via Anatolia farmer ancestry and later selection. WHG generally lack them. So Western hunter-gatherers generally, before admixture with Anatolians, didn't have these markers that we associate with light skin in modern Europeans. So in other words, a lot of early studies are suggesting that Western hunter-gatherers, for the most part, are dark-skinned. Okay, that's what the studies are suggesting. Let's move on. Caucasus hunter-gatherers. Okay, once again, I'm not suggesting, by the way, all of these people are black, but we're looking at all of the contributing groups. We're looking at early European farmers, we're looking at Western hunter-gatherers, and now we're looking at Caucasus hunter-gatherers. Likely intermediate to dark, darker than early European hunter-gatherers, okay, but not as dark as sub-Saharan groups. This is what it says about Caucasus hunter-gatherers. They carried alleles for lighter skin, so they did carry them, but not yet the full suite of depigmentation variants common in later or modern Europeans. They were also lactose intolerant. All right, so we have three groups contributing to what were these early Europeans. And each one of these groups, Western hunter-gatherers, Caucasus hunter-gatherers, and early European farmers, have got direct or very, very strong phenotypic links with modern Black people. So this would have been a at very lightest intermediate skin, but at darkest, very dark to black skin. This would have been a very mixed, leaning towards dark-skinned group of people, even without the sub-Saharan ancestry. That's what the studies say. This is one of the reasons why they concluded that the builders of the Stonehenge were Black, okay? All of the studies are bringing back the fact that a lot of these people carried pigmentation that suggested that they had dark skin. So the idea that, you know, this dude and this uptown girl would have stood out, maybe felt a little bit awkward. Oh, daddy, I've got kinky hair. I don't like the rest of them. I've got Nigerian hair. I'm a bit dark. I think personally, that's a bit of a myth. It's a bit of a myth. All right. That's this is what the studies are saying. I don't, by the way, let me make this very, very clear. I do not, by any stretch of the imagination, need any of these people or groups to be Black. But this is what the studies are saying. They're suggesting that they are dark-skinned populations. Okay? We've looked at them all. I haven't made any of this up. You can feel free to research it in your own time. But the bottom line is the idea that these would have been some lily white populations with a couple of octoroons being uptown girl and this thingy, that's just not supported. Okay, it's just not supported. So this is why I'm slightly weary of these studies, just because of the fact that they kind of want to other Blackness when actually there's no need to other Blackness. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that dark pigmentation was relatively available and relatively common amongst them. Doesn't mean that they're all black, by the way, but just raises the argument and a strong question mark as to what the ethnic makeup of these individuals were. Now, if you want to refute that, feel free to. Feel free to come back and tell me WHG, EEF, and all of these groups are all lily white and show me the papers to prove it. I'll go, cool, I was wrong. But at the moment, from what I can see, this is what the studies say about the ethnic makeup and the phenotype of these groups. Okay. They were what they were. So let's now move on. How far are we in? We're approaching an hour and a half, but I do want to get into the paper itself. So let's have a look at the paper itself, and then we will wrap up for the day. How are we doing? 164, 100 likes. That's cool. We got a relatively good crowd for a Tuesday night, I have to say. We got a relatively good crowd for a Tuesday night. This is pretty cool. All right, let's carry on reading the paper itself. Boom, 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 boom. Hit up the likes, please, people. So remember, we talked about the fact that there are two papers here, and they're very similar. I'm going to go straight to this one because it has the chart. Yeah, I'm going to go to this one. So I think this is the one about Uptown Girl, if I'm correctly. No, this is the one about the guy. Let's go through this together. So ancient genomes reveal cosmopolitan ancestry, maternal kinship patterns at post-Roman Worth Matravers, Dorset. So kinship can be difficult to discern in archaeological record, but the study of ancient DNA offers a useful window into one form of kinship, biological relatedness. Here, the authors explore possible kin connections at the post-Roman site of Worth Matravers in southwest England. They find that while clusters of genetically related individuals are apparent, the inclusion of unrelated individuals in double or triple burials demonstrates an element of social kinship in burial locations. Some individuals also carry genetic signatures of continental ancestry, with one young male revealing recent West African ancestry, highlighting the diverse heritage of early medieval Britain. The role of kinship in archaeological investigations. Kinship was central to early medieval societal organization, and after the fall of Rome AD 476 became a cornerstone of legal, political, and social landscape of Europe. Who you were related to defined social position, relative freedoms, and even the possibilities of marriage and procreation. The challenges and opportunities presented by kinship are described in many legal and cultural documents, including the early English laws and Irish hagiographies, which place emphasis on the paternal line. Yet kin associations were not exclusively limited to patrilineal relationships in the early medieval period. In Ireland, although descent groups and male founders, they were subsequently bilateral. For example, King Ecach of St. Patrick, I know I'm just murdered that name there, but you have to just deal with it, told St. Patrick that he hoped to extend my lineage from the body of my daughter by the procession of grandchildren, and expected his future son-in-law to join his household. The relationships encompassed by the term kin varied across cultures, and the same document suggests that he lived that the lived experience of residence and kinship were as adaptable in first millennium AD as in earlier periods of prehistory, taking various forms dependent on circumstances, with social relationships and often prioritized over biological relatedness, where communities needed to adapt in the face of change. Now, I'm looking at the time, and it has hit the half-past mark. And I feel like what I actually want to do is have a little bit more time to pull out the important paragraphs between now and tomorrow, so we can just kind of like put a pin in this. I think we've done a good job today. I actually quite enjoyed going through this study with you guys, so you can kind of get a good idea that there's more to this study than basically meets the eye. We are going to talk a bit about some of the genetic lineages as well, because it's really interesting, because all of the males in these studies seem to fall under the E lineage, which I found very, very interesting, because the claim is being made that the only relationship these people have to Africa are these kind of like random grandparents, and the ancestry couldn't have come from anywhere else, and yet they all carry E markers, which I found very interesting. And the only way they can explain that is by really pushing back the E marker. And I know that there's the arguments made that it's a derivative of the E marker that changed on the European continent in the last 14,000 years. But I'd say we'll have a read through tomorrow. We'll have a read through tomorrow, because I find it very interesting that they're not just putting out, indisputably, quote unquote European markers. They're putting out these markers that have very close ancestry with modern West Africans, which once again leads some more weight to what the larger picture here, which might be there might be more to this West African ancestry than just a couple of merchants, hopping on a ship during the 7th century, which is exactly what I'm thinking anyway. But that aside, I hope you got the bigger picture, which is that melanated ancestry in Europe is a thing. As much as people might be, even in the comments right now, coping all over themselves, oh, get your own history, this, that, and the other. I didn't write these papers. If you don't like the fact that Europe keeps turning up Black ancestry, or Europe keeps turning up, Black bodies, or people who have Black DNA, then go back in time and teach them some white supremacy. Because the bottom line is, a lot of these people are coming back Black, or dark skinned, or very dark. All right. And you can whiten them as much as you want, or you can put a straight head wig on Cheddar Man if that makes you feel better about the fact that he had dark skin and Black features. do whatever makes you feel good, man. Whatever floats your boat and makes you feel comfortable. But the bottom line is, you're going to have to deal with the fact that more and more physiognomically Black people are going to be discovered as a part of archaeological research in Britain and in other parts of Europe. Okay, so that's all there is to it. So I think we'll wrap up this here for now. Before I go, guys, we are in the last week of my book raise. Okay, I'm still a little bit off the target. Okay, so without saying too much, if you haven't bought yourself a copy yet, or bought a copy for someone you care about, friend, relative, child, niece, nephew, if there's a forum, or there's some kind of, maybe there's a school or non-profit, people would benefit from this work, please do share it with them. It would be fantastic to get this over the mark. We're doing really well, by the way, but we are in the last week, so I'm going to do my last week push on everybody to see if you can order your copy of Reconstructing Egypt. It's going to be a game-changing work. So let me just quickly pop the link. Let me just quickly pop the link in the chat so that everybody has an opportunity, if they so wish, to participate in that, because that would be absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to pin that to the top of the chat now. Okay. And yeah, do me a favor, grab a copy and get me over the mark for before I launch. Yeah, that would be absolutely awesome. We're not far off at the moment. We're 68%. So we've got less than a third to do before we get over the mark there, guys. So yeah, see what you can do. It'd be absolutely amazing to see you guys get me over the mark there. Audio copy, share it with people who you know will like it. But yeah, I think that's that. Is that okay for you guys if we wrap it up? I know it's been an hour and a half, but if I'm gonna do one tomorrow, I'm gonna have to reserve my strength. Okay, so we'll call it a day there. Let me just quickly hit the comments quickly, see if there's anything that I urgently need to respond to. And whilst I'm doing that, let me give another shout out to Dregger. Oh, listening at work, beware the vandals. Yeah, we got a couple of them in the chat. Stephen, thank you very much for your $40 again. Nata, thank you very much for your 20 Swedish krona. And James, thank you very much for kicking us all off with your $5 donation. It's much appreciated. And yeah, see you tomorrow. She who must be obeyed. That is such a dope name. Oh dear. Sorry. And thank you everybody else, guys. Much love to everybody holding down the chat. My fantastic moderators. Remember, if people get too trolly, you know what to do with them. But I think it's been under control. Letting people cope in the chat is actually quite hilarious as well. Sometimes you've got to let them do their coping out loud. You know, why not? Who's it harming? All right. But anyway, guys, have a fantastic day, fantastic evening. I will see you tomorrow if all is well and good. Peace. Thank you, Wildflower. Great live stream.